Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Barner. I am the head of content and operations here at Art of Procurement, and I would like to welcome you to today's AOP Live session. Now, I'm going to bring a couple of guests on stage with me in just a minute, but before we get into even the topic, just a couple of quick logistical housekeeping things here. If you haven't joined us, this is AirMeet, the platform that we're in. You'll notice that there's a chat panel and a Q&A panel up and down the right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to weigh in, say hello, post comments, add questions over there. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through the conversation. The other thing that's very unique about these events has nothing to do with the platform, and it's actually the format that we use. So you'll notice that other than myself and my two guests and our smiling faces for the next hour, the only visual that you're going to be seeing during today's session is a designed poll result that many of you actually voted in to help us collect some data for today's session. So this is entirely live. It's entirely conversation driven. And so that's where we definitely look to you for your comments, for your questions. We have some things that we know we want to talk about, but we welcome you and we encourage you to use your voices as we go through today's topic. Now, on that point, our focus for today's session is something that anyone in procurement and supply chain knows we are absolutely never going to get away from, and that is change management. So we're going to be talking about maximizing procurement's potential by taking you through an expert's guide to effective change management. It's sort of an exciting topic. I know it's one that already gets my blood pressure going up, but nonetheless, it's unavoidable. We have an expert with us who's going to help us feel okay about it, manage all of these challenges, but then we're going to discuss realistically, what does procurement need to know to be able to handle the amount of change? Now, before I bring them on board, let me tell you who my guests are going to be today, starting with that change management expert. I'm going to be joined by Chandell Shorter. She's the senior consultant of change management Corcentric, and a returning AOP Live favorite, Joe Payne. He is the SVP of Source-to-Pay at Corcentric. So without any further ado, let me welcome them both up on stage and we will get going. All right, Joe and Chandell, if you guys can turn your cameras on and unmute, we will get going. So typically at Art of Procurement, we start podcast conversations, we start sessions with questions about whether procurement found our guest or whether our guest found procurement. But Chandell, in your case, I'd like to ask something a little bit different. How did you end up with specialization in change management?
Oh, change has been a big part of my life. It's a big part of all of our lives. When you wake up, either you have a brand new gray hair or something about you has changed, whether it's your mind or the way you feel about the day because of the weather. But really, change management found me in risk management, where you're dealing with regulatory and compliance issues. And, it can be a little staunch, and they always forget the people side of change. And so I was kind of innately doing change management and risk management. I just didn't know that it was called something special. I thought it was just common sense. You think about people and you make sure that people are able to migrate with change. And then I found out that it was actually a discipline. So change management kind of found me over there in risk management, hanging out.
Now, does specializing in it and accepting that it's going to be part of your reality, does that mean that you're someone who's okay with change? Have you, as you focus on this professionally, has it changed how you personally feel about change in your life?
I actually love change, but then I'm like a really strong D personality, big picture, big strategy. And when you're dealing with strategy, you really have to love change. You can't really get comfortable where you are from a competitive perspective. So I'm typically that person who kind of disrupts the status quo and says, why do we do things this way? Really a big continuous improvement person. So I like change even, in life. Like I like to change my wardrobe, my hair, styles. I have all different types of genre of music. I just kind of change with the day. Otherwise, life is boring if it just stays the same.
All right. Well, Joe, before I come to you with a similar question, I'm just going to out myself. I struggle with change. In fact, I was just looking down as I was thinking about what we're going to discuss today. I don't even like to change pens. I like to use the same pen to the point that I have a large box of this kind of pen right down there off camera. So we've got the full spectrum of how much you love or feel comfortable with change between me and Chandell. Where would you maybe plot yourself personally and professionally on that continuum?
Well, it's funny you say that about pens because I had a similar experience with my phone just this weekend. So my old phone battery was dying and the plug wasn't working right, so it wasn't charging. And I've been putting off for over a month, even though it's functionally not working, going to Verizon to get a new one because I just hate it. I think some people are like, oh, it's time for a new phone. It's going to be faster and the pictures are going to be better and all that. Yeah, exactly. And I felt literally had a pit in my stomach thinking about the passwords and, my app's going to be there. What's going to happen to I don't remember how to set up my email, all these things that just, yeah. So personally, I guess I hate change to some extent. But on the flip side of that, my degree in college was operations and information management. And there was a huge component of efficiency, effectiveness, and continuous improvement, right? Like you cannot have, by its nature, continuous improvement cannot exist without change. So I would caveat that I think professionally, I do feel like I'm an agent of change, and I think it's a good thing. The question is, what is stemming the change and where is it coming from, right? And I think there's, especially in the world of procurement, there's two types of change. There's change that aligns to innovation, right? How do we become more innovative? How do we become more efficient? How do we make things easier? Like, we talk about all the time, Kelly, how to make the easiest process the right one to follow versus, going and buying things on your own or through a P card or something else. So if it's innovation driven change, I think it's a good thing. If we're positioning change as compliance driven, which is really the other side of the coin in a lot of ways. But if we're saying, our change is going to be driven so we get more compliance and we can increase spend under management, I think on the surface that's fine. But when you drill in, the change management you need to make those things happen is going to be a lot more cumbersome. So it's really about the spirit of the change versus what you're trying to get out of it. And how you manage that, I think, ultimately determines if you're going to be successful or not.
Yeah. Well, speaking of managing change, let's see how the art of procurement community feels about change. Actually going to pull up the results of that poll we ran so that everyone can see them. And I'm just going to read these into the conversation for anybody who's listening in live or listening in later. But the question that we had asked was, which of the following is the greatest source of procurement's change management challenges? And the four options we had given in order of the vote, in first place with 31%, we have passive aggressive resistance. We're definitely going to talk about that. In second place, a very close second place with 28%, lack of executive support. Third place with 23%, not actively managing the change that needs to happen. And then in 17%, in fourth place with 17%, still close, not communicating the why and having that affect change. Now, I will say we always get a lot of comments when we run these polls. We probably got the greatest number of all of the above comment responses that we've ever had to one of these. So lots of multi-factor challenges associated with change. But Chandell, I want to come to you first as our resident change management expert and get your initial thoughts. What comes to mind when you see the results of this poll?
Oh, so the audience is super smart. They were really close in identifying what the number one challenge for change is. I mean, from a best practices perspective, which is sponsorship, executive sponsorship. So it was at 28%. Passive aggressive resistance came in at 31%. I would say that that's pretty fair within the procurement community. Because with finance, there's black and there's white, there's really no room for gray. And you do run into a lot of very polite people who under the surface are like, go away, get out of my business. I have my process, leave it alone. Yeah. So this is really good. The people that participated were spot on.
Now, quick question for you. So this is self-reported data, right? So we have procurement explaining why they think they have difficulty with change management. Is there a possibility that in this 31%, where we believe that other people in the company are being passive aggressive and simply making the silent choice not to go along with the change that we want, that in fact it's some combination or a symptom of issues with the other three, and it's maybe how procurement is explaining it to ourselves? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to change management, change is scary. It's hard, right? You heard Joe talk about the fact that he had a panic attack, like just thinking about getting a new phone. So just imagine the essence of your job changing or an entire new system, right? That can be completely overwhelming. And communicating the why of why we do it. Oftentimes we think that we're explaining it in the best way that we can, but sometimes executives, tying this back to sponsorship, their words are really lofty and their why is very lofty. And in an environment now where everyone is hypersensitive to the market and their jobs and the competitive nature of the industry, people really want to understand the why.
Absolutely. And Chandell, I think we've locked up on your video a little bit. So I'm going to switch over to Joe.
And I like to make this statement that Joe Madison says, I like to put it where the it's not simple enough to be able to consume and understand. Okay.
Joe, let me pull you in. What are your thoughts on either the poll results or on some of Chandell's comments?
Yeah, so I think I'm on the same page. If I really think about the top two reasons, I think this is where you were going with it as well, Kelly. Passive aggressive resistance and lack of executive support. I believe those are symptoms of not actively managing change and failure to communicate the why. So the reason you're going to predominantly have passive aggressive resistance and lack of executive support are for those two reasons, honestly. Not actively managing, so not having a change management plan in place and not properly communicating the why. And that kind of goes back to my earlier comment around, is it an innovation-driven change or a compliance-driven change? If I'm a stakeholder out in the field that needs to get parts to make a line run, your 14-step procurement process is avoiding that it's not passive aggressive. It's getting their job done so they don't get fired and so that the line keeps running. And they need to know that it's not about making sure that you're doing your job correctly, person out in the field. It's about making your job easier. That's really important. So I think as a function, at procurement, we tend to be in our own bubble, and we think it's very logical to say this is best for the company. It should be best for everyone in the company, but other folks have different priorities. And so being able to think about that and have a robust change management plan that ties not just to your priorities, but to theirs is fundamental in a P2P transformation or any change related to P2P. And I'll just, one other thing I would say, that whenever we start a project helping a customer with any type of transformation, which you can read as any type of change, I will not engage in that project if I don't have firm commitment of executive support. So that's a change plan on our side, is making sure that, we've got a C-level person saying thumbs up, that it's not a passive aggressive thumbs up, that it's a real thumbs up. and that they're willing to go to bat for the project. Otherwise, when the project runs into hiccups, they're going to point that back at to us, or you could read that as at procurement or whoever's running the project. When ultimately, if you don't have sponsorship, you won't be able to get it done regardless of how good your change management plan is.
Yeah. Well, Chandell, that actually reminds me of one of the things you had mentioned in our prep session that truthfully I hadn't thought about, is that change management exists in most companies on two different levels, at least at the same time. There's sort of the overall culture around change management, how it is addressed in the company as a whole. And then there's all of these individual projects, transformation journeys, departmental efforts, and things going on. There's sort of smaller or micro change management within that macro culture and attitude about change management. Could you talk for a little bit, especially in light of how much we've focused so far on executive support? Can you talk about how that culture and attitude and how it connects with the change management effort that we're able to make at the project level?
Sure. So, change management is a muscle, right? All of us have memory muscle or, physical muscles, right? And change management really is a muscle, and it's something that you have to exercise. So everyone really in some instance should be change agents. I actually argue to most corporations that change management should be a competency that's measured for all leaders through HR. It should be a formal process, right? And the reason being is because leaders have to be agents for change. They have to be able to ensure that they're there to help people move through the change curve, especially at the project level when it's very focused changed and it's impacting a certain group, right? You have to be able to have that strong muscle, even if you don't like it or you don't understand it, to be able to empower others and move them through change. With organizational change, it's a little bit easier because, you're kind of in an office, you're backed away with the executives and you're looking at strategy and organizationally determining which way we should go. And culturally, does it align with our standards, our morals? So that's a little easier as long as you have a good play or a good understanding on your organization and the people. And as long as the organization has foundational morals.
Mm-hmm. Should we assume that more mature organizations or more mature teams are going to be better at change management, or is there not necessarily a connection there?
So I'll go first on that.
Sure.
Oh my goodness, Kelly, are you a comedian today?
I would say that.
I was going to say, because most large organizations do not have a mature change management program. They're very resistant to a structured change management program.
Yeah. And Joe, you were going to jump in on that as well.
Yeah. So I would echo Chandell's comments there. We see a lot of times that the more mature an organization is, almost the less inclined they are to follow basics of change management. I would say that, how big a company is, or how long they've had a particular function and how mature that function is. I wouldn't call it an inverse relationship with their ability to impact and effectively manage change. It's certainly not, but it's close. But what's really more telling than maturity or size is corporate culture. And that goes back to Chandell's earlier comment around, do leaders, are they trained in change management techniques? Is there a competency when you hire resources that you're looking for folks to impact change? And some corporate cultures, maybe you actually don't want that, right? Maybe if you're a very stable industry or company and you've got a long-term plan that doesn't involve a lot of restructuring or a lot of changes because you're good where you are, and maybe sitting on a cash cow, then that's fine. Yeah. But in companies that are growing, especially growing rapidly, and maybe they can't keep their internal processes at pace with their projected or forecasted revenue growth or their goals around revenue, then you really need to have a corporate culture of change, and that folks that really champion it at all levels. And that's really what makes or breaks your ability to effectively manage change.
Yeah. Now, Chandell, you said something earlier, and as simple a sentence as it is, I don't think it's something that can be said or heard often enough. Change is hard, partially because change is uncomfortable. In a lot of cases, it goes against the grain for us as humans. Now, sometimes change involves extra hard things like jobs being impacted. And when you're someone that perhaps has a very good company culture and you've got good relationships with this people, how can sort of +1 levels of discomfort affect our ability to manage the change itself? Not necessarily do we feel good or bad about it, but knowing there's that additional complexity. Is it harder for us to manage change, even if we're typically good at that?
Yeah, change is hard to manage and process at any level, which is why I always recommend that you give change in pieces, bite-sized pieces. Bring people along the way anytime they feel as if they're engaged and they have some type of onus or buy-in or accountability to a change, and they're not being lied to or things are not being hidden from them, and then just boom, there's a change. Then they're better able to eat it, right? They're better able to move through the change curve because it doesn't feel as if you just dropped the bomb on me, right? It's kind of like you've been preparing me for this along the way, which is why it's so important for all leaders to have this competency and are able to do this, right? But at the end of the day, sometimes we try to measure the impact of change based off of an executive's view of, oh, this is just small, or it's just changing this one field. I've had people that have actually gone out into full panic attacks, had to be hospitalized from their seats being changed.
Oh my goodness.
So change, yeah. So you can't underestimate how it will impact a person. That's why it's so important for leaders to know their people, and also for them to really embrace change management to help guide them through a strategy on the what ifs that could happen and the reactions, the resistance, as well as sometimes it's not even passive aggressive resistance. It's just right there in your face. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do it. One of my favorite things to say about change management is a skill, heal, or will. Either you don't have the proper training in place to give people the skill to do what's changing. Yeah. It's a heal. It's too clunky. It's too hard. Systems that, didn't have a lot of, technological strategy in the background to build a framework for it to be intuitive can be too clunky and too hard. You added too many steps to the process, or you added more time to my process to do my job. That's heal, right? So it's just hard. It's not that the people are resisting passively. It's just really hard. You made it hard for them. Maybe you didn't get their feedback. Maybe you didn't bring SMEs in your design, right? And then the last one is will. I just don't want to do it. I don't like it, and I don't want to do it. And Joe's explanation for why we're doing this, it doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah. He didn't get on my level, and I'm just not going to do it. And if there's a way around it, over it, or through it, I'm going to do it to not change. And that's the innate nature of people.
Yeah.
I just might add to that, as Chandell was talking there, reminded me of a change my wife was going through at her job. So she's got a software system she uses to do her job every day that she's been using for 20 years and has complained about for 20 years. Almost on a daily basis, the stories about it not working and rebooting and IT. And about a month ago, she told me that they were going to change it. And she was complaining about that change, right? So, there's this comfort level. It's the same comfort level with my phone, that even the best changes, there's going to be reluctance for. And it's important not to be surprised by that, but just to expect it.
Yeah. Now, Joe, follow-up question for you. It's actually based on an interesting comment that I can see has come in on the side from Rodford. He says, I have had great success enrolling folks in the change when I explained the why in an honest manner. Too many times it is dictated. So 2 questions I have for you, sort of as a follow-up. Is it harder to roll out change when there's bad news, right? Do you have any advice for, listen, we're not all going to love this process, but I have some bad news. We have to make this change for some reason. But then I'm actually interested in this comment about honesty. Are the people leading the change sometimes so bracing for the impact they're going to have, whether it's passive or whether, as Chandell said, they get right up in your face? Do we pull our punches and kind of mask the change and not come right out and explain how much it's going to affect people, especially if there's some bad news in the mix?
Oh, I definitely see that the bad news type of change gets kind of sugar-coated, right? And it's like, oh no, don't worry about this. It's not going to impact you. And that gets you through a conversation, but it doesn't get you through the change management process, right? And so, yeah, being as forthcoming as you can up front. Not always you can't always be, depending on the change you're enacting, fully forthcoming and transparent, but as honest as you can be. And I would add to that, again, this is kind of the reoccurring theme for me, empathetic, right? Not just understanding your side of where that change is coming from and why it's being driven, but the other person's side and what they're going to hear, because there's going to be that reluctance. So to think about why they might have a reluctance or where their issues are going to be with the change. And I think to that comment is having that in your playbook of conversation topics. Hey, I know this is going to be trouble for you. I get that, but it's going to help over here, XYZ. Let's talk about the procure to pay process, right? When we go into a customer, let's say we're doing an AP transformation project. A customer comes to us and says, we've got paper invoices, nothing's digital. We're typing it into a spreadsheet or into an ERP. We're paying with a check. And we want 100% straight through processing. First question is, do you have a PO process? No. Is procurement involved with this project? No. Okay. We're going to back up a few steps, right? And what we're doing in enacting AP best practices, we're truly actually changing and transforming procurement in a lot of ways to get a fully functioning AP organization up and running. And so we have to factor those things in. And sometimes that's good for procurement. Sometimes they're not aligned with it. But connecting those dots is critically important. And to have those honest conversations up front of why we're doing things and what impact it's going to have, not just for your department, but for other departments, is really important.
Now, Chandell, one of the things that you had said the other day, and honestly, I'll remember it for the rest of my life because it involved cheese. So secret tip, you want me to remember anything forever, involve cheese in some way. You talked about how you could take one of those little bricks of cheese from the supermarket. I'm a Cabot fan. I'm a New England girl. And so if I handed you that brick of cheese and said, eat this, most of us, I think, would be like, oh, that's kind of gross. I don't want to just bite chunks off of this big bar of cheese. But if you slice it nice, or maybe put it in those little cubes that look so good on a charcuterie tray, now you're able to still eat the same volume of cheese, but it's a little bit less sickening, one bite at a time. My question for you based on that would be, how do we go about breaking what we're hopefully thinking of as a longer, more cohesive change journey into bites? How do we figure out for our team, for our situation, for our organization, what's the right portion of cheese to be handing out at each step so that people are open to it and have an opportunity to digest before we move on to the next piece of change?
Well, I say, first of all, when you come up with these great ideas, executives out there that may be listening, bring your middle management team in. Middle management is typically where we have that break stop. That's where our risk is in ensuring that change crosses the finish line. If you can bring them in and run ideas by them, you may not have even settled on anything, but they have more buy-in because they feel as if they're being brought in early. So you're building trust at the level that you need to of people that are closest to your frontline employees. Simply call engagement. We don't wait when we're pregnant, right? Women who are moms, we don't wait until our belly is like huge and big to tell our kids that we're having a baby. No, you start to try to get them comfortable with that idea very early on before those signs of change begin to show. And so when we're able to engage and let people get excited about it, and let people feel things out about the change, and let them talk about it and how they're going to benefit from it. You're going to be a big brother. You're going to be a big sister. You're going to be able to help. You'll have a playmate, whatever it is, whatever that with them, what I call the what's in it for me is for those people, then you're able to really break that up into bite-sized pieces by simple engagement. And you do that at the layers that are appropriate based on the information that you can share, right? So you kind of want to start, right there in middle management. But then once you've kind of settled on a solution, build a power user of change champions. People that can be a part of your, UAT testing, people that can be a part of even the design if you're able to have that flexibility, right? Get people excited about it and involved and engaged, and they'll be able to eat all of the cheese.
Well, and having those change champions, absolutely, right? That's where you achieve scale. But just to sort of take that idea and maybe back it up to the executive sponsorship for a minute, when we're looking for an actively engaged executive sponsor of change, what does that role actually mean? What are we looking for that person or that couple of people to do so that they're not just a name on a letterhead or somebody that's listed as part of the project, but so that they have a positive impact on the organization's ability to process that change?
Oh, Kelly, that's a great question. Executive sponsorship is not just your name on a paper, and it's not just me writing a communication for you to send out. It's the person who can make decisions, right? The person who doesn't delegate it to someone lower than them, and the person who I can have access to as a change practitioner to let them know when the building is on fire and your PM is just telling you it's not. So change management is typically your best friend over any other discipline. And I've been a project manager, so don't shoot me out there, PMs. But change management is going to give you the brutally honest truth, whether you need to pause, stop, or turn down the pressure of how you're rolling out the change. Whereas project managers, we're typically kind of in a box and we want to stick to our deadlines and we want to hit our targets and our milestones. So we may be a little bit more reserved or hesitant to tell an executive sponsor, hey, we're at risk of this not being as successful. Versus, if Joe calls Chandell in there, he's calling somebody for the truth. That's when he really needs to know, hey, is this really going to work? Or is this about to blow up in our face, right? So that's what I would say to that, Kelly.
Yeah. Now, Joe, if we make this procurement specific for a minute around the executive sponsorship, a lot of times the changes that procurement is tasked with rolling out ultimately affect everybody. Based on what you've seen, should it be the CPO that's that executive sponsor? Should it be CPO plus someone in finance or plus someone in operations? Do you need to sort of have that cross-functional representation and buy-in and support like Chandell was talking about, so that people aren't just looking and saying, well, yeah, of course this person supports the change. They're in procurement and they've been directed to roll this out. How do we think about bringing in different stakeholder perspectives as we're building out that executive team?
Yeah, so I would say that in any major transformational effort, you need to have a more of an executive committee than a single person, right? And that they can kind of hash out tough decisions together and create some level of cohesiveness, especially when it impacts multiple departments. But that doesn't mean that there's multiple executive sponsors. There still has to be a single visionary. They're kind of what Chandell was talking about with the three kind of roles. But I would add to that they are the ones that are continuously repeating the why. Like, this is the vision. This is where we're going. Yeah, there's lots of bumps that are going to come along as we go and things we didn't think about, but we're going here. At the end of the day, we're going to be here. And this is why. And that there's a lot of repetition there. And then there's also some ownership tied to that. And so this is where it gets difficult for some folks who haven't braced themselves for that executive sponsorship. Is at the end of the day, you own the result. And if that's for better or for worse. And so if you don't get to the vision you wanted to, what does that mean for you as a manager or as a leader? And if you do get to the result and it doesn't turn out to be what you expected, what does that mean? Now, the plus side of that is if you truly believe it and you enable it to happen, then the results speak for themselves.
Yeah.
But you've got to understand that the best executive sponsor is not the one that's willing to do that. I would call it almost passive aggressive. Hey, keep it up, everybody. It's owning the result and knowing that it's going to be that they have some stake, that they actually have some stake in what the outcome is. So, what would I recommend in a procurement transformation? We see it both ways. If that sponsor is a procurement person, or if procurement rolls into finance, is it a CFO or head of shared services or operations? Ideally, I would say an executive sponsor is going to be in the more CFO, chief supply chain officer type of role that can maybe speak more broadly to areas of the organization outside of procurement, because we are enacting change that's going to impact those folks. And so I think we've seen it be more successful if we can get a little bit beyond procurement for those big changes. But it's not really about the role as much as it is about that person owning the why and owning the result.
Yeah. Well, one more thing that I want to take on, Chandell, before we go on to actually making the change happen is, procurement over the last few years has taken on a lot of responsibilities. Certainly change management is part of it. Multi-tier supply chain risk management. All of a sudden now everyone assumes we know how Scope 3 emissions tracking works. And then, of course, there's all of the other ESG projects. There's AI, there's robotic process automation, there's machine learning. So we're supposed to be sort of jacks of all trades, but we're never really trained up on any of this. And we may or may not have developed the skills naturally through the projects that we worked. So given that and being fair, is it realistic to expect that someone who has reached the executive level in a company knows how to be an executive change sponsor, or might we have to either coach them or ask for very specific things in order to ensure they fill the role that we're looking for them to be in?
Executive sponsorship is not something that's clearly innate in most leaders. So when you look at different disciplines like ProSci or ACMP or AIM, they all have sponsorship coaching as a part of the change practitioner's role to help support. Now, you do have to have a sponsor who's open to that. Some executives are type A personalities. They're not very open to people telling them your tone is off, or, you're not reaching the people where they are. However, as long as they're open, then I suggest always ensuring that you have some type of coaching program within your wheelhouse to help executives kind of understand what you need them to do and what it means to be an executive sponsor. And I was going to put in the chat box that, there's one model that works really well when you have a CFO, which is really the person that should be the executive sponsor. You can also have an acting sponsor. So the executive sponsor does everything that I mentioned before, but the acting sponsor is kind of that person who may be a little bit more accessible, and that may be in the project team meetings, or you may have a monthly meeting, standing meeting with maybe biweekly, a little bit more regularly than you would with the CFO. And then, that way you can kind of, based on the level of resistance or issues or risk that you see, you would kind of use that chain. So your acting sponsor will be first, and then kind of your executive sponsor will be that next level. So that's another model that also works.
Yeah.
But it's not something that people just come, born with. It is definitely something that they have to be coached through.
Now, as we start to go to our last topic, which is really in the trenches, making change happen, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions you'd like me to pose to Chandell and Joe, if you'd like to know more specifically what that type of pen is that I use, any questions about all of this change adjustment stuff, feel free to type those in. I'll keep an eye on that and I'll check it before we wrap. But Joe, when we think about procurement being involved in a project where change management is going to be some part of it, and that's probably all of our projects, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but when should we start thinking about the change effort associated with the project that we're hoping to lead?
Yeah, I would go back to Chandell's comments around if you have children and you're about to have and you're expecting, you don't wait until the belly shows to tell the kids that as early as you possibly can. So in a broader transformation effort, as soon as the transformation is in the discussion, the change management needs to be kind of planned out.
Yeah.
But I would add to that though, look, as sourcing and procurement professionals, every day we are dealing with change. So, if you think about running an RFP, you're a indirect sourcing manager supporting a marketing department, and the marketing department is looking for a new agency, an ad agency, because their contract's about to expire. Well, by nature, if we're going to run a sourcing event, there is an implication that there might be a change in suppliers, right?
Yeah.
Now that might not seem like a big change, but for the stakeholders, it can be a huge change. And so what we've done, we've actually, as part of when we run sourcing events for our customers, we're integrating change management into the life cycle of that sourcing engagement from soup to nuts. And we're doing that because we know at the end of the day, running a sourcing event in itself is not a business outcome, right? Like, sure, we want to know how many sourcing events you can run in a year or whatever, and there's goals around that. But it's being able to realize, savings or improved quality or improved service levels from your supply base or other elements around, what you use that supplier for. And that's what you're trying to get to when you run a sourcing event, are those kind of business outcome focused improvements. However, your stakeholders, they're going to be adverse to change because there's work in it for them of training a new supplier, getting them up to speed, learning how to work together and all these things. So we will, when we're actually doing the initial data collection for a sourcing project, incorporate change management elements, get the stakeholders as part of the project, get their input, continuously get their alignment of, hey, if we get to the end of this and your incumbent supplier is not the best, what are we going to do? Get them thinking about it so that it doesn't come to the end of the project and we can't implement something because we haven't, covered those factors. So I guess I would say as early as possible, at the inception of the initiative or even prior to that, you should be thinking about the change management that needs to occur.
Well, I think using the example of onboarding a new supplier is sort of the perfect example. I remember back from my practitioner days, we would get, we'd select the supplier, we'd go through the contract, there'd be implementation, and then that, maybe 90-day implementation window would be done. And initially it was sort of like, okay, good luck. We're going to be over there just assuming that everything is going great. And we'll talk to you in 3 years when the contract's back up.
Yeah.
But of course, in reality, that is not the way it works. And so that's where, as procurement gets more sophisticated and programs put other structures in place, you have ongoing quarterly business reviews, or at least touch base with the stakeholder. Hey, is everything going okay? Is the contract doing for the company what it should? We don't just, stick our fingers in our ears and assume that everything's going great. I think it's the same thing with change. You can't be dedicated to sort of the long tail of change management forever, because at some point, if you've rolled it out right, people need to be doing the right thing. But there do still need to be touch points where you come back, and whether it's through conversation or through some type of systems reporting, you look to see, okay, did this change hold? Chandell, if we find an instance where we're touching back in and we find that change wasn't adopted, or we find that it's splotchy, maybe it's a little bit of the time and a little bit not, is there a way to re-engage and say, okay, nope, we're going to realign this. We're going to reinforce this change that we tried to make, maybe diagnose what the problems are? How do you come back into a change management effort that has largely been considered done, but maybe didn't quite hold as well longer term as you wanted?
Well, typically it's not about whether the strategy or the plan was appropriate. It's typically because you didn't put measures or controls in place to monitor it over time. And that's what's key. Some people think that change management can't be measured. It truly can. Adoption rate, utilization rate, and a quality department that actually includes an attribute in their quality checks to ensure that people are using it, or even a system usage report. So if we see a drop, what should happen is that inherently you should have a resistance plan in your change strategy. So along the way, you're actually addressing resistance versus not. They didn't have measures. They didn't have any measurements or metrics to ensure that they had visibility or an early warning system to show them that, hey, something's not sticking. But to your question, when you do have to come in, let's just say those metrics weren't put into place. Easy engagement is really just pulling those very metrics. You go in and you say, let me measure adoption, let me measure utilization, and let me measure, people's responses through focus groups to identify what happened and why didn't it stick. And once we can identify that root cause, then we can come in with some different tactics to help get people back on board and actually get the change to stick. But it's all about the metrics. You still get back to the metrics again. Either you put them in first, or you don't, and it doesn't.
Joe, was there anything you wanted to add there around metrics? Maybe something procurement specific, something that you've seen work particularly well. I know it's a little bit harder even to measure quality as you start to get into the services area, and yet we still have to be able to do that from a supplier performance and contractual perspective. But any companies that you've worked with where you saw them make particularly effective use of metrics to monitor how change is being adopted?
Yeah, it ties to, are you focused on the quantitative or the qualitative or both, I think, and where we've seen change really be effective and be able to take actions to course correct is where we look at both, because you can look at, back to a metric like straight through processing of invoices. You can easily measure that and see improvement. Okay, so we made changes and this is the result. But what about stakeholder satisfaction with the new process, right? What about, do they feel like their job is easier? Do they feel like the changes have added value for them? So you might actually have, from a numbers perspective, a really good outcome, but people feeling not great about what that outcome is. And so getting the qualitative metrics established as well as the quantitative are critical to what comes after the initial change, which is going back to our initial conversation around continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. Because whatever you enact, you want to make sure you've got the ability to not just kind of rest on your laurels when you're done, but to continuously improve. And that's gonna require a little more nuance than just, hey, are the numbers where we thought they would be?
Yeah. Now, quick follow-up to that. I actually have a question that's come in from Marlise asking about maybe some specifics around capturing adoption and utilization rates as an indication of change. I mean, is it as simple as we identified X users of a given platform and we can see how many of them have logged in, or we can see how many of them are regularly using the system? Is it that straightforward, or is it a more complex equation than that?
It is certainly more complex. So that ties exactly to what I was just saying about, what goes beyond the numbers. I had an old boss that wanted everyone to use a particular software, and the metric for is this being utilized or not was login. And so what the outcome of that is that everybody knew that once a month they had to log into the system. Didn't mean that they were using it at all.
Yeah.
And so I think you do need that baseline level of measurement. Are people logging into the system, and maybe even adding to that, how much time are they spending and things like that. But in a sense, it's the wrong question. It's more around Are people getting value out of it? And how do you put some metrics around that? How do you even do like a customer satisfaction, as they complete a transaction or do whatever kind of workflow you've built in that system? Is there a smiley face or a frowny face, right? And so it's really important. It's really important for that continuous monitoring to occur, to be asking the more, I would say, feely type questions of how do people like the system or like the process, and then course correct where you see consistent feedback that maybe points to there's holes that need to be buttoned up or areas that could be improved.
Yeah. Chandell, let me pull you in on that. I like this point about there are metrics that are easy and convenient to measure and capture, but they may not actually indicate that we're getting the outcome that we want. How do we ensure that we've picked metrics around either business outcomes or the change effort itself that ensure we're actually achieving what we set out to with the effort?
Okay. Yeah. So if we're automating, right, transactions, then if we measure the number of transactions that are circumvented and or the number of manual transactions that one person or several users or a group of users are doing, then inevitably they're doing something to circumvent the change that we've put into place. So it's not always like the positive portions of login, for instance. To Joe's point, people find a way around that. They just log into the system once a month, and you think you can measure utilization off of that. You can't. Also tying KPIs to increase productivity, turnaround time from a customer perspective, as well as from an internal perspective. Straight through processing should definitely give you a return on investment of turnaround time. So we should be able to measure transactions that way, especially if it's systematic. So those are really hard numbers that you can truly tie to utilization. Now, adoption sometimes is a little different than utilization because you're having to see if people are really following a process, if they're truly adopting the culture change or the culture shift that you've put in place, even as it relates to procurement, right? So if you're going from this paper, environment to a paperless or less paper environment, that's a big culture shift. And people, as long as paper exists, will try to still stick to that paper in some type of way, and they'll circumvent it any kind of way you can. Now, the best thing to do for that is to try to put as many controls in place to ensure that they're not working in duality. So you should only have an exceptions process by which you would do something like that, setting thresholds, but then also identifying, do you pull a report that says Joe is an abuser of this acceptance process? Typically, that means that he is resistant to the change, and we need to pull Joe to the side to have a conversation. Or it may be a specific area that does that, right? And so that's kind of a way that you can also measure adoption. Focus groups, surveys, but the hard numbers don't tell the lies. So I put a couple of things in the chat that will help some of our procurement folks with that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I would add that if you want to, get a paper-based process eliminated very quickly, stop reimbursing for toner for people that work from home. That's the surefire way to get rid of a paper-based process.
Oh, that's funny. And how does that work for procurement's relationships internally, Joe? Asking for a friend.
No, don't worry about that. Blame it on finance.
Oh, geez. As we start to wrap our time, we've covered a lot of ground today. But Chandell, we kind of started today's conversation with you talking about your natural embrace of change, the excitement you see in it, maybe how it's linked to parts of your personality. And Joe and I kind of saying, yeah, I always use the same pen. I'm never going to change my phone again. Professionally, we understand where it needs to happen, but maybe it's not our favorite part of the job. For people that are sitting here right now saying, yeah, everything that you've said is so great, and I get that change is unaffordable, but I still really don't like it. What advice do you have for us to shift our mindset in a more positive direction around any change, procurement process related or otherwise, or at least to get out of our own way so that we can be more effective participants in a change process, even if it's not our favorite thing to do?
First of all, to thine own self be true. So be honest with yourself on whether you like change, you're uncomfortable with change, and why you don't like change. It's typically because we're hardwired to be in control. And anytime you have to let go of some of that control, or you feel like you're losing or it's slipping a little bit, then you typically want to get kind of on the defense and a little defensive or resistant. But what I tell people, first of all, to thine own self be true. Ask yourself, why are you uncomfortable with this change? And when you ask yourself that, write down all the questions that you have that will help move you past this roadblock. So asking questions helps empower the person. It helps you find yourself, locate yourself on the change scale. You know, like, am I nervous about it? Am I in the middle and I just need more information? Or do I feel really informed, but I just have a couple of more questions? So finding your own self-empowerment within change will help you navigate the change curve, whether you like it or you don't. Being honest with yourself on why you don't like it. Sometimes it's as simple as they don't like the executive sponsor, or the executive sponsor is tied to a change that wasn't successful in the past. And so now they're like, I don't trust anything that this person does. Chandell rolled this out and it was terrible. I had a terrible experience. So we have a point of reference, but being honest with yourself and then saying, how do I get through this? And what questions do I need answered to get me over this hump? That's really the best way to help navigate yourself through that change curve.
Excellent. Well, I'll be honest, I don't see myself running out and loving change, but I do love Shakespeare. So if Laertes has advice that can help us get through this, add on a little bit of cheese, I think probably we're all going to be okay, especially considering the fact that it is inevitable. So Joe Payne and Chandell Shorter, I would like to thank both of you for joining me today to answer all of these questions about change and share your expertise and your personal perspective. I'd like to thank everybody that participated in the poll, that joined us live today, and everybody as well that will listen to or watch this event later on demand. If you are with us live, there's actually a link up on the screen right now that will let you check out other upcoming Art of Procurement events. Again, thank you all for your time and for your energy. On behalf of the entire Art of Procurement team, I'm Kelly Barner, and I'm so glad that you were with us today. Have a great rest of your day.